We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker. I'm your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Professor William Jones, a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. He's the author of several books, and the most recent is The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of the Civil Rights Movement, which we're going to focus or at least start our discussion with today. So thank you for joining us, Will.
Thanks for having me on, Dean.
So let's start out. Probably Dr. Martin Luther King's speech there, this famous "I Have a Dream" speech, is probably about the most famous speech all of us grew up with in the country's history. Obviously, very important, but it's really only a part of the picture. And as you point out in the book, it's missing a very large chunk of it. So let me just begin. What do you see as we all know the speech, and a great speech, but what are we missing when we hear that speech that we should know about from the march?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're right. It's actually, I think it's often ranked the most well-known piece of rhetoric in American history. Also globally, it's very well known globally, and it's obviously a tremendously powerful speech. One thing that I think is important to remember about the speech is that Martin Luther King was the last speaker. Basically, nobody wanted to follow him. Right? They knew he would knock it out of the park, and they didn't want to go after him.
I could imagine no one ever wanted to speak after Martin Luther King.
Right. So by the time he got on stage, he didn't really have to talk a lot about what the march was about, what the demands are. You hear the speech, you really don't get a sense of what the goals of the march were. That had been laid out in in detail. Before then, Bayard Rustin actually came out after Martin Luther King spoke. He was the primary organizer of the march, and he read the demands, right? Just went down them, right? And led people in a pledge to uphold them. Martin Luther King's job was to really rile people up and inspire them and send them home ready to continue fighting, which is what he did. And that's why we remember. I think the problem with the memory of that speech, though, is that we often treat that speech as a sort of not just an encapsulation of what the goals of the march were, but what the goals of the civil rights movement were, right? It's sort of seen as, lines from that speech are routinely trotted out as this is what the civil rights movement was really about, right? And people fight over it, when in fact it was a very vague and sort of inspiring speech. The things that were really clear at the time about the goals of the march was that the goals of the goals of civil rights and racial equality could not be separated from the goals of economic justice. And in fact, the march began as a march for jobs. And it was initiated in a context of concern over employment discrimination, shutting Black workers out of jobs, at a time when the economy was changing dramatically. And so without both finding more new jobs and opportunities for Black workers, but also eliminating discrimination in the manufacturing jobs that were there, it was going to lead to even worse unemployment than we saw in the early 1960s. The early 1960s, it was sort of the nation was coming off the really massive growth of the post-war period. There was a little bit of softening, and it was hitting Black workers the hardest. And so there was sort of a sense that this was pretending harder times. And so the march actually was originally conceived as a march for jobs. Interestingly, it was initially focused on the AFL-CIO, the Labor Federation, as a protest against their unwillingness to support what was known then as fair employment opportunity or fair employment legislation.
It's worth reminding people because, again, it's easy for easy for me to forget that. I won't speak for anyone else, but at that time it was still totally legal to discriminate. You could just say, I'm not going to hire you because you're Black. So
yeah, and that was totally normal. I mean, you can read classified ads from the time, and it says, we're looking for a Negro man, we're looking for a white woman, and that was totally the norm. And
yeah, which is kind of, again, not that we've eliminated discrimination, but I don't think anyone would openly say, we're only going to hire whites. They might end up doing that as a practice, but they're not going to say it.
Right. And I think it's important to remember how transformational that is. I mean, I think we take it for granted that that's wrong, that, like people still do it, but they wouldn't boast about it.
Yeah.
But then it was seen, as totally normal and totally acceptable. Of course, you're going to hire somebody based on their race or their gender.
Okay. So I'm sorry I cut you off there, but
yeah. So, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the initial impetus was a concern for jobs. And that, that was, it came largely from Black trade unionists. A. Philip Randolph was the most famous of them, but there was a whole network called the Negro American Labor Council. Of several thousand Black trade unionists all over the country. And they were actually, their initial idea was to march on the headquarters of the AFL-CIO. This was also in the context of this ongoing struggle for desegregation in the South. And so, which had been really peaking, since the late 1950s. And some activists said, well, yeah, it's important to focus on this question of jobs, but we have, the questions of voting rights. We have integration in the South, the school desegregation. There had still not been any movement toward school desegregation. We're talking 5, 6, 7 years after the Brown decision. So the slogan for the march, which became For Jobs and Freedom, was conceptualized as bringing these two sets of demands. These were, the economic concerns that were largely focused on winning access to jobs. I think they were more pressing for Black workers in northern cities. And they were, and trade unionists, people who were working in industry, who were in industrial communities, some in the South, but also in the North. So Jobs and Freedom brought that together with these civil rights demands that were coming out of the Southern movement, voting rights, access to desegregation, access to education and public accommodations. And that was really the principle. So if you read the 10 demands of the march, they go through those various settings. And I think we often overlook the economic demands that were really central to goals of the march.
Yeah, you're mentioning of the unions is, the AFL-CIO is of course striking. The AFL-CIO often has been very important in promoting civil rights, but that was not always the case. And as I recall, the UAW did support the march, if I remember correctly.
That's right. So the AFL-CIO itself did not officially support the march. They didn't endorse the march. There was an industrial union committee of the AFL-CIO, which was essentially the old CIO industrial unions, right, which the biggest of which was the auto workers. They supported it very heavily financially and bringing people out. The garment workers union also supported it financially. The really important role I think that unions played was in mobilizing people. So the distributive workers in New York City, the meatpacking workers in Chicago, the auto workers in Detroit, they, in those places, these were, heavily Black unions, right? And so the Black leadership in the unions, they chartered buses and trains. In some cases, from California, they chartered airplanes. And what they would do is they would sell tickets on those vehicles to their members. They would hand out, books of tickets to their members and say, go sell these to your neighbors in your neighborhood. And that was a way of funding the march because they would recoup the cost of the transportation. But it was also a way of recruiting participation in the march. And overwhelmingly, the large delegations were these union delegations, and they were interracial. They were, led by the Black workers within these unions, and it was the Black workers who sort of pushed those unions to support it. But they, that's why when you look at the crowds, they're, many of the people are wearing union pins or union hats, and they're, it's it's a strikingly interracial crowd, and it's largely a working class. Philip Foner, or the historian Philip Foner, estimated that it was the biggest march of union members in American history, which probably is no longer the case, but it was probably the case at the time, that it was a massive union march. Sort of in spite
that is
of
striking.
the
It's again, another part of our history. It's easy to forget. At that time, somewhere around 25% of the workforce was unionized, and today we're looking at around 10%. So they were just hugely more important. And the opposition, at least some unions, or at least the unwillingness to support the march, a lot of the unions were openly segregationist. It was very difficult. I'm thinking here first and foremost of the building trades. So It was very difficult for a Black person to get an apprenticeship with, the plumbers. I can't say for certain the plumbers. I'm guessing that the plumbers, the carpenters, the electricians, and obviously it differed city to city because those are very much localized unions. But that was a real source of discrimination, that these were relatively good paying jobs that were just excluded Blacks. I remember I once spoke at a bricklayers, pretty sure that was a bricklayers meeting in New York back in, it's probably about the turn of the century, 2000. And we were talking about Social Security. And I look around the room and literally everyone was white. And, I don't know, 40 people there, all men too, I should point out. So this is, and again, I don't know that they had any formal prohibitions against Blacks, but obviously it wasn't very welcoming to Blacks. That you could have a room of 40 people and every last one is white. So anyhow, but that was.
I think that's a really important part of the story, and it actually goes back to the origins of. So the '63 march was an idea that was first proposed during the Second World War, which was a march against employment discrimination that A. Philip Randolph had initiated. A lot of the people who organized the '63 march were involved in organizing the one during the Second World War that was ultimately called off. But it was that idea of fighting against employment discrimination really emerged during the Second World War as the thing that was holding Black workers from escaping the Great Depression, right? As the war sort of brought the nation out of the Great Depression, Black workers were not getting jobs in the war industry, jobs that were doing that. And they were also unionized jobs. Many of the unions had explicit bars, racial bars, and gender bars on membership. You just couldn't join the railway unions, the machinists union, a lot of the building trades unions. And so that focus on making that illegal, emerges as a goal in the 1940s and is really realized in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, in what would be Title VII of the Act. And I think in some ways, the most important objective and perhaps the most important outcome of the march was to add that provision to the Civil Rights Act, which when President Kennedy initially proposed that law, he actually explicitly said, we're not going to include a law prohibiting employment discrimination, because he wanted the law to focus on things that would make sort of Southern elected officials upset. And he sort of said he was ready to sort of write off Southern Democrats and lose their votes, but he could not afford to lose Northern urban Democrats. And he was worried that he would start to lose them if he proposed an employment discrimination ban, which would be a national law, right? The voting rights issues were sort of restricted to the South. The school desegregation was a national problem, but it was only legalized in the South. And so that was really focused. It was seen as a Southern issue. But the employment discrimination thing, and actually housing discrimination, that's why it was also later, were seen as more politically difficult for the Democratic Party. And that was why Kennedy was really hesitant to do that. And the civil rights, the march in '63 really built a coalition around that, which actually, I think that the success of the march showed the AFL-CIO leadership that it had been a mistake to not join that march. I think it was kind of embarrassing for the leadership of the AFL-CIO, and they came on board afterward and really played a key role in passing getting Title VII added to the law.
You mentioned how I actually didn't realize that Kennedy didn't have that included. So that's a very interesting history. So I guess if had you, well, who knows? We can't do a counterfactual. What happened had he not been assassinated? But in any case, clearly that did happen, at least in part, because Johnson had stepped in. The housing, now that wasn't included. We had the Fair Housing Act passed a couple years later, as I recall, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that was one of the goals of the march, was a ban on housing discrimination, but that wouldn't get included in the Civil Rights Act.
Yeah.
In the 64 Civil Rights Act. It would be later in 68.
Yeah. And again, it's, of course, it's striking. Obviously, it's good to at least have that in the law, but obviously that doesn't change it in practice. And, I grew up in Chicago, and, this was after the Fair Housing Act. I mean, I guess I was growing up when it passed. I was born in 58, so I don't know, I guess I was 8 or 9 when it passed. But you had neighborhoods in Chicago where, you were taking your life, and if you're a Black person, you were taking your life in your hands if you just, like spent an afternoon there, if you had a friend there and you spent an afternoon. And certainly trying to buy a house. And there were some Black families that did buy a house, and, they'd get threats. In some cases, their house would be firebombed. It was, again, this is after the Fair Housing Act passes. It was illegal. Well, it was always illegal in principle to firebomb someone's house, but, it was illegal to discriminate, but that was very much the practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, there's discrimination in housing and in employment, persists, as we've mentioned. I mean, it's a matter of enforcement, and as the enforcement backs away, people. Yeah.
And it's, of course, you have the history that, certainly Martin Luther King till his death, but, it continued. That very important goal of the civil rights movement was full employment. That, the idea was that, Blacks, when you had a weak economy, Blacks disproportionately suffer. And
right. And that was the thing that, that was something that A. Philip Randolph really focused a lot of attention on. And he said, as long as you have Black workers and white workers, competing for a declining number of jobs, Black workers are always going to lose out. They're just not, they don't have the political power. They don't have the social clout. And so you're always going to have that. And so the only way to really address that is, one, you have to have very strong and well-enforced laws against employment discrimination. But the real solution has to be, full employment. And that's the only way in which you're really going to have access to jobs to everybody who wants one. The other thing that they also insisted on was that, that it wasn't enough to have access to jobs. You had to have jobs that paid a living wage. And if you look at the demands of the march, they were really clear that they actually, one of the demands of the march was to create a federal jobs program that would provide every worker who wanted a job with a decent job at a family supporting wage. And they also argued that the minimum wage would need to be increased to be a decent standard of living, to provide a decent standard of living. So that was another demand, was increasing the minimum wage to a level that's, I think at this point, it's about probably $20 or $25 an hour that they were saying would be necessary in today's dollars to provide a decent standard of living.
It's striking how much backward we've gone on that, because it's I've done a little work, not that it requires that much work, but if you look at the minimum wage, we first had the federal minimum wage put in place in 1938. And from 1938 to 1968, it roughly tracked productivity growth. So it didn't just rise with inflation. We're having productivity growth year by year, and it's about 2.5%. So you had the wage rise, the minimum wage rise 2.5% above the rate of inflation. So if inflation, say, was 2%, the minimum wage rose 4.5%, the 2% plus the 2.5% productivity growth. And that was through 68. And, it didn't create high unemployment. In 68, we had about 3.5% unemployment. So, the economy was growing well. People had jobs. It was going in the right direction. I'm not going to say it was, everyone was happy or anything, but, you could say it was going in the right direction. And the minimum wage, adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage peaked in 68. We still aren't back to where we were in 68, adjusted for inflation. And I did the calculation, I should update it some, but I did the calculation a couple of years ago, just saying, suppose it had continued to follow inflation continued to move in step with productivity. So not just inflation, but rose in step with productivity growth. It would be about $25, $26 an hour today. And you just think of how different the world would be if, the people were lowest paying jobs, people, cleaning, toilets, custodians, and people working in McDonald's, that they're getting 26. I mean, my God, we'd be a very, very different world. So
that's right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think there were some smaller increases in the 70s, but they weren't able to keep up with that.
Yeah, no, we are thankfully they did, because if you just looked at nominal dollars, I think the minimum wage in nominal dollars was something like $250. I'm guessing. I'd have to double check what that is, but back in 68, of course, that was worth 5 times, 6 times as much in today's dollars. So there have we raised it some in nominal terms, but the last increase in minimum wage was passed, I think, in 07, and there were 3 steps, and I think the last one was in 09. So got a long time without even, an increase in the nominal wage. And of course, it's nowhere near kept pace with, certainly inflation and certainly not productivity. So we're falling, with that as a benchmark, which, to my view is a very reasonable benchmark. We're falling further and further behind.
Yeah.
So on the theme of full employment, we had the Humphrey-Hawkins Act passed in 76, which was kind of a bone to that, I guess we should say. And I don't know, do you want to talk about Humphrey-Hawkins at all in that context?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, I think people involved in pushing for it saw it as a fulfillment of this demand that actually comes out of the March on Washington for a federal program to, create jobs, creating sort of federal responsibility for full employment. Of course, by the time it made it through Congress, it was watered down to the point that I think a lot of people saw it as not really as kind of meaningless. But I think it's an interesting, it remains as an interesting sort of item of sort of an example of trying to push for that. And perhaps, the seed of something in the future that somebody could push for. But my understanding of it is that it doesn't have any real meaningful power.
Yeah, I have sort of a depressing story to tell you on that. So the Humphrey-Hawkins Act, I'm forgetting the exact wording, but it's something to the effect that the Federal Reserve Board is instructed to target the lowest possible unemployment rate. And again, it wasn't exactly those words, and stable prices or price stability, something like that. And it defined the lowest possible unemployment rate as 4%. We could argue whether you could do better, which we did do better for some years. In 2019 and 222, 223, we're down around 3.5. Maybe we could do better than that. But in any case, we had relatively low unemployment rates. Anyhow, back in the 90s, the conventional wisdom in the economic profession was that you couldn't get below 6% unemployment. And this wasn't just the conservatives that said that. Liberals, I know Krugman, who, I consider a friend. I think he's a good economist, generally pretty progressive. He mocked the people who thought you can get much below 6% unemployment. He said, they're like people who believe in, deny the existence of a hole in the ozone layer. And I guess there were some, I guess they were, atmospheric scientists. I'm not sure what type of scientists, but they denied that. And obviously, it was a hole in the ozone layer. And, we restricted ozone emissions to try and contain that. Anyhow, that was a widely held view. You couldn't get below 6% unemployment. So the unemployment rate had been falling. This is coming out of the recession in 1991. Had been falling. It had gotten to 6% and was still on a downward track. And I was working at the Economic Policy Institute in Washington at the time, very close to labor. And we were able to arrange a meeting with 2 members of the Federal Reserve Board, Ellen Blinder and Janet Yellen. And what we wanted to talk to them about was whether they would let the unemployment rate fall further, or whether they'd start raising rates. Because, it was widely talked about. We didn't have any inside information. It was widely talked about. They were planning to raise rates. I think they probably even said that. Greenspan's chair at the time probably said, well, we're going to have to raise rates. So anyhow, we wanted to talk with them and make the case. You really don't have to raise rates. There's not much risk of inflation. You could let it see how low it can go, whatever. So anyhow, we presented some evidence. I had some papers by some economists. I won't go into detail there, but arguing that, look, there's not much risk of inflation. You can let the unemployment rate fall. And Blinder was doing most of the talking. Yellen was there, but she said much less. So Blinder said, well, you haven't convinced me. So I just said, well, even in your models, inflation rises very gradually. So if, what's the risk of, why can't you let the unemployment rate fall to 5% and see what happens, And he said, well, the Fed is an institution that's committed to price stability. I said, well, you're also committed to 4% unemployment. And then he just said, oh, no one takes that seriously.
Oh, wow.
And then the best part was, I said, well, you don't have to take the commitment to price stability seriously. He goes, yes, I do. and I'm saying this not at all to pick on Alan Blinder, for whom I have a lot of respect. He's a good, decent person, liberal economist. But this was the mindset. It was, you wouldn't find too many economists who would be, like a respected economist who would be to the left of Alan Blinder. But that was, that was where we were. So anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the political impact of unemployment is much weaker, I think, particularly among voters, right? Than the political impact of high inflation rates.
Yeah. Well,
you can see why
that certainly has seemed to be the case. I mean, in the in the Biden years, I was looking at the unemployment rate and go, well, this is great. We got down to 3.4%. Again, you could say we could do better, but it's 3.4%. Black unemployment fell as low as 4.8%. That was an all-time low since we have records going back to the early 70s. So that looked pretty good to me, but that was we did have inflation. I don't think they were directly related in the sense that suppose the unemployment rate had been 2 percentage points higher. Yeah, I'm sure inflation would have been somewhat lower, but most of that was the supply chain story. So to my view, we had some very good things happening in terms of people getting opportunities in the labor market. Massive job quitting, which again, you hear employers say, I can't keep anyone. But, from my vantage point, well, workers that have a bad job, they could leave, get a new job, or tell their boss, give me a pay raise, give me a promotion,
Right. I mean, we saw a real upturn in union activity during that period, largely, I think, because of that tight labor market.
Yeah. And, again, in terms of, beating, I should shut up here, but just the issue about a tight labor market being good for Black workers, the Black-white wage differential also hit a low during that period. So, I mean,
it's going to help the workers at the bottom of the wage scale to have a tight labor market, and I mean, I think that was it shows the ongoing concern that that there has to be conscious policies to address these economic disparities that follow racial lines in a way that I think often gets forgotten in the sort of that we sort of focus on other aspects of racial inequality. That these are the real and these are the bottom line issues that, particularly for working class Black for Black workers, that are really central.
Yeah, and again, going back to Dr. King, again, I think a lot of people forget, when he was down in Memphis where he was shot, where he was killed, he was at a strike for sanitation workers.
Yeah. And that's actually, I think, a really important story that is often overlooked and I think it's really important now as we see this real assault both on the public sector and on federal workers. I mean, we just saw the elimination of collective bargaining agreements for the Veterans Administration, for FEMA workers, but we've also seen, this sort of assault at the local and state level on the rights of public employees. And that's been a place where Black workers, have had a tremendous impact on improving wages and working conditions in a sector that was actually more open to Black workers, but was chronically underpaid, and where the labor rights and the access to things like Social Security protections and minimum wage protections were restricted in the public sector. And so the story of that Memphis strike is one of a really important broader story of Black workers going into the public sector and taking jobs that were available to them but that were not very well paid, and unionizing. So this is a period when we see really dramatic rise of unions in municipal public service, in healthcare and education, in these workplaces or employment sectors that are actually expanding rapidly. And I think that plays out some of the arguments that you see from people like A. Philip Randolph, that the importance of a sort of expanding labor market, provides these opportunities for Black workers to get in. They're not, a job is often not enough, right? It's not enough to have a poorly paid job, but it provides some leverage that, in the right context, you can use to actually create unions and provide some stability. And that really paid off in a lot of those public sector jobs.
Yeah,
we're seeing, and I think is really important to remember as we see the backlash against that. I mean, you can see that in sort of in a microcosm in Washington, D.C., where there's, it's a heavily African-American city. And I think we're going to see, we're already seeing massive layoffs, and it's going to be really devastating for Black workers and in Washington, D.C. But that, I think, will ripple across the country.
Yeah, I'm forgetting the exact number, but I believe the federal workforce is somewhere around 20% Black workers, somewhere in that neighborhood, and that's against, again, not an exact number. I think it's 11% for the workforce as a whole. So it's considerably more, much higher percent Black. So when you see layoffs, it just stands to reason. If there's no discrimination, if you cut the federal workforce by, let's say 10 or 15%, which is, their targets, I think they said 20. I don't know where that stands these days, but in any case, they're clearly laying off a large number of federal employees. Disproportionately, those are going to be Black workers.
Yeah. And that's true at the municipal level as well. You see these really high percentages of disproportionate concentration of Black workers in municipal jobs. And, they depending, those are very, they're subject to state law. So, depending on what state that you live in, some have very strong collective bargaining rights. But in a lot of states, they don't have any collective bargaining rights. And so they're really dependent upon the local political situation.
And of course, that's been a battleground because you've had a number of states like Wisconsin, first and foremost, and I'm sure it's been other states as well, where you've had Republican efforts, and unfortunately, in the case of Wisconsin, very successful to to roll back, I'll just say, collective bargaining rights. And of course, the Supreme Court decision that they in effect, they're all public employees are now in effect right to work, in the sense that I hate to use that term, but unions can't say that you have to pay for representation. So no one's ever forced to join a union. That's a misstatement. But you could sign a contract. Unions could sign a contract saying that if we represent you, and they're obligated to represent the whole workforce. So if you have 1,000 workers and say 900 join the union, the other 100 say I don't want to join it, the union's still obligated to represent those 100 people. They can't say, oh, you don't get part of the contract. You don't get protection if your boss wants to fire you. We still have to represent you. So under the law, previously they'd been allowed, well, for private sector, they still are. They could say, okay, we have a union contract. We negotiate with the employer, and it says that, everyone, you're benefiting from the contract. You have to pay for that protection, for that benefit. And that had been allowed in the public sector as well. But the Supreme Court, 3 years ago, they said that was, I forget what term exactly, I guess a violation of individual rights. Again, to my mind, it's kind of like, the employer could put any conditions they want. They could say you have to wear a stupid cap. You have to, they could tell you anything. And, it's,
right.
you say it's
That's
not
not a
you.
violation of your rights.
Yeah. But,
Yeah.
if your fellow workers say, hey, we have a union here, you're benefiting from it, you have to pay for it, they
Right.
say, no, that's a violation of your rights.
Yeah. The Janus decision, and I mean, we've seen a series of really of sort of a legal assault through the courts on the rights of public sector unions, and it's true in the private sector as well. The rights of unions has been really dramatically scaled back, but the public sector had been a place where unions had been able to hold on more than in the private sector, and that's still the case. The Janus decision, I think, a lot of people saw that as a death knell for public sector unions, and I think they were able to say, well, you should probably join the union anyway because you're going to get a lot of benefits out of it. And they sort of appealed to workers' sense of solidarity, and that generally has worked. I mean, because it's very easy for unions to demonstrate that they improve wages and working conditions and that they benefit the workers that they represent. So they've been able to make that case. But they're increasingly under very difficult conditions. In Wisconsin, the passage of Act 10, which basically made it illegal to join a union. I mean, it made unions, the certification for unions, extremely difficult. It also said that unions could only negotiate over wages, so they couldn't negotiate over benefits or working conditions at all, only wages. So it was difficult to get to go through the process of a union certification, and then if you did that, you couldn't really gain much. And in that state, we saw this really dramatic. I think the union membership fell by more than half in Wisconsin in the public sector. It actually had a big impact on union representation in the private sector as well. So there was a really dramatic decline, in a state that was a traditionally a strong union sort of state. So that was a really devastating. That law is actually in the courts now, and I think it's likely to be overturned. So we might see the rebuilding of at least the private sector or the public sector union movement in Wisconsin.
That's in Wisconsin State Court?
That's right. Yeah, it's before
so they now have a liberal or Democratic majority.
It's a liberal majority in the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Which
that would be a bit of good news if that ended up being the case.
Yeah.
So I don't want. I guess I'll see if you want to get too much into the bad news since Trump's been in. I'll just mention one thing that just to my mind, it hasn't got anywhere near the attention it warrants, that the unemployment rate for Black workers is now 7.2%. So it's really quite striking that the unemployment rate for white workers has little changed. I don't have the number at my fingertips, but it's little changed from even from its low point 2.5 years ago. But since Trump took office, but for Black workers, it's just really gone through the roof. Now, again, the numbers, the monthly numbers, no one's cooking them, but they're erratic. So maybe we'll get a good number and it'll fall back to 6.8 or something. But there's no doubt there's been a large rise in Black unemployment in a very short period of time, and it's disturbing. And I don't know if that's likely to be reversed anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think again it's hard to know where that's coming from. I mean, I'm sure that part of that has to do with the federal job cuts, and but probably not enough to explain it all. But we also see this pattern that we've seen for a really long time of Black workers being the first, to suffer from a downturn, right? So they're sort of the canaries in the coal mine, and the softening of the economy is going to hit. They tend to be they're the last hired, and so they're the first fired, and so that's a pattern that we've seen for a long time. But you're right; it's a really striking reversal that from this period. I mean, under Biden, in which the sort of the Black and white unemployment gap narrowed, and now we're seeing it sort of yawn again.
Yeah. Well, I always wonder, I don't know how racist we should think Trump and his team is, but you just wonder, like, presumably someone there knows, and I'm just wondering, like, how do they think about it? Do they think about it? I have no idea. But
yeah, I mean, it is remarkable, and I think that for my entire life, I think there's been assumption that there's sort of a sort of consensus on the idea that at least that the ideas or the goals behind the civil rights laws that were passed in the 60s, that there was some consensus around the goals. There was a lot of disagreement over whether how to enforce them and how to how rigorously they should be reinforced. But to find ourselves in a situation where the ideas of equal employment, right, the idea that Black people and white people should have equal opportunity and equal access to a job that they're qualified for, is thrown out the window, right? I mean, now we see an administration that essentially is saying if a Black person's in that job, or if a woman is in that job, they must have gotten them it because they're not qualified for some, it was sort of an affirmative action hire, right? And so the very idea that, and you see the same pattern with college admissions, right? If we have, if we have Black people getting into college, then it must be discrimination against white people, right? And so the sort of basic assumptions that I think, like, I've spent a lot of my career saying we need to pay attention to economic justice as much as we do to racial equality, right? That those two things go hand in hand. But now we're seeing both of them completely thrown out the window, right? And treated as suspect and invalid by an administration that's really, trying to roll back, both the economic justice and the civil rights goals that emerged out of the 1960s. I mean, in some ways, going back to the 19th century.
yeah, no, it's kind of incredible. I mean, it's things like I forget where it was. It was in Smithsonian. They had something to Jackie Robinson. You're just going like, he's a fantastic baseball player. So like you're going to deny he was a great baseball player, deserving recognition. I mean, it just
right. And it's the idea that he was like, somehow just because it was only because he was Black that he was recognized. Right?
No, just absolutely loony. And, again, I trust that people watching are familiar with Jackie Robinson, of course, the first Black player in the major leagues. And, no one could doubt he was a champion, batting average champion, fielding. I mean, no one, there's not a team in baseball that wouldn't have wanted him on their team unless they didn't want a Black person, which,
right.
But, it's just crazy, to question that he was there because he was an outstanding baseball player. And, obviously they excluded many fantastic Black players because that was the policy, and he broke the color barrier and, just made his accomplishments all that much more impressive because he had to deal with, racism from the fans and obviously many of his teammates, and,
right. And I think, the understanding then was that he had to be twice as good as the Black player or the white players to get any attention, right? So it was not that he was getting in because he was Black. It was like he was getting in spite of the fact that he was Black and because he was twice as good as his competitors. Yeah. So these are I mean, we've seen this reversal that's
it's depressing. I keep thinking it's got to turn back. And I'm still optimistic. I mean, how can you not be? But I can't see exactly how it's going to turn back at this point.
Yeah. Well, it's going to take a lot of fighting.
Yeah. So, is there anything else that we should cover before I let you go today?
Well, I mean, we're coming up on the I think it's the 62nd anniversary.
Yeah, yes, I should mark the date. That's right.
Yeah, so it's and I think I think it remains. I guess there's a couple of things that I think are really important to sort of take away as the why we should remember this. I think one is that connection between civil rights and economic justice that's really essential, and the way in which it comes out of the history of the civil rights movement. But I think for if we're looking at lessons for today, the way in which they organized it and the way they built a really national network of activists and organizations that were unions, churches, community organizations, I think is a real model for creating a national movement. And if we think about turning things back and trying to win some sense of justice, it's going to take a movement on that kind of scale. So
Yeah,
I hope people will look at that as a model.
Yeah. No, that's an incredibly important point that obviously the unions, or at least many of the unions, not all of them, but many of the unions were tremendously important in organizing the march and the larger civil rights movement. And the churches, and particularly Black church, but there were white churches that were also supporting the civil rights movement that played a very important role. And, well, there's still many powerful Black churches still have a lot more here. And so there are plenty of people at white churches. Unfortunately, it seems more of the white churches are kind of on the other side right now, which is.
Yeah, but there are predominantly white progressive churches. There's also there's Jewish synagogues and associations and really rapidly growing Muslim community in the country that I think I think interfaith organizing remains a really important aspect of trying to push some of these demands.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I shouldn't be dismissive at all of that, because I've had occasion to work with many white churches, Black churches as well, but there are progressives in white churches, and with the Muslims, that actually that's a very important point, is you get a larger Muslim population, plenty of conservative Muslims, but there are plenty of progressive ones, and we see one in New York, New York City, and that's a good story.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it would be remarkable to have a Muslim mayor of New York City.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Hopefully, it was 3 months away, so hopefully, be the first Muslim mayor ever in New York City. So that would be a good story. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks a lot for joining me here today, and let's we'll have you back sometime, and let's hope we have some better news to talk about.
Yeah, let's hope for that. Well, thanks for having me on, Dean. It was nice talking to you.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.